And you could take an entire semester on the American Revolution, like leading into and the American Revolution and the post-revolutionary era. So this is going to be a broad kind of bird's eye view. Today we're going to look at colonies that are leading us as we build these colonies in the New World and how that gets us closer to revolution. If I remember correctly, Brandy has it set up on a 3-lecture series. So the next one will be the American Revolution, and then afterwards, the third one and the final one for the summer will be over the formation of the constitutional republic, what that looks like, kind of what our founding fathers were thinking about in that era, in that time period. But also I want to not only emphasize that this is a broad stroke overview, but that as historians and as Americans ourselves, I really believe that we should look critically at the past. Now, that does not mean that we should hate everyone in the American past, right? Like, they're bad or they're evil, which also as a historian, I don't particularly care for those kind of words because that's too one-dimensional. I think there's multiple things can be true at once. But we are going to talk about some kind of conflicting ideas that the founders had and that the people who are participating in the revolution had. But I just want you guys to realize that as Americans, as historians, it's okay to be critical of the past, right? And I believe that, in my opinion, that that's what the founders expected of us, right? As Americans and as humans, so it's not just something that we do in America, but as humans, we have a tendency to hold the past and the people who participated in the past as these heroes on like high, right, who were perfect and never made a mistake. That is not the case, right? And I would assume then 250 years from now, people are going to look at us and be critical of us and say, oh, they did some really good things, they did some really bad things, and these are both true at the same time. All right, so I want to start us off with kind of a thought-provoking quote, maybe, if I can get the internet or the computer to work. All right, here we go. All right, so this is our quote that kind of sets us off. And the quote is from Samuel Johnson, and this is in 1775. Johnson wrote this phrase appears in his essay called Taxation, No Tyranny. And he says, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of the Negroes? All right, so the idea is you have these people in the colonies who are calling for liberty, yet they also embrace and continue to promote enslavement, right? Also, to be very clear here and to be very fair, I have talked to folks who had no idea that enslavement existed outside of the southern colonies. All 13 colonies participate in enslavement. Okay, it is not just the American South, it is not just southern colonies. Okay, so this is a symptom of the entire colonial experience, not just a southern experience. All right, so as I said, Johnson wrote this in 1775. Now, Johnson himself is not a patriot by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, he is one of the most celebrated literary figures of England and of the English-speaking world. So he's from England, and he is offering a critique on the arguments being made in colonial North America. All right, so he's a loyalist. All right, and he's thinking about this from a loyalist perspective. Additionally, I would like to encourage you anytime, all my students, anybody who ever asked or is thinking about history in the American past, when we're looking at things that people are saying, who are these people? What is their experience? And how does that experience inform what they're saying? Right? So everyone comes with a background. All right, so this guy, he's a literary figure, and he and many other loyalists thought it was absurd, right, that people who are arguing for liberty would also engage in enslavement. And to be fair, Johnson is not wrong in his assessment here, okay? Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence. In that declaration, he stated that all men are created equal, while also holding over 100 people in bondage, all right? George Washington fought for liberty while his home, which is known as Mount Vernon, thrived mainly due to enslaved labor, all right? This tension of this enslavement versus liberty is not a mere footnote of the American past. I would argue it is one of our defining features, all right? And that tension will run through these 3 lectures this summer. All right, so if Johnson says this, right, I like to think as an American historian, so I obviously approach a lot of things from the American side, right? He's on the British side. What did he miss and or choose to ignore? All right, that's what I would ask my students. What did he miss? All right, first of all, I think he's missing the colonial perspective. All right, he's missing the colonial perspective. And what I mean by that is those who are protesting British taxation are coming from this because they believe that they are fighting for something that is real to them. All right, so they oppose colonial taxation, which we will talk about here in a little bit. But their language of liberty wasn't flippant by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, we see that this idea of liberty is a sentiment that is very much rooted in the British way of life and in colonial America's way of life, all right? They are pulling this idea of liberty from this long-held tradition, and that tradition is the English common law, all right? So the colonists live and function under the English common law, all right? But we also see them being influenced by the Enlightenment period, which we'll talk about at the end of today. And then also there's influence there by Protestant theology, especially from that of the New Englanders and their approach to Protestantism. All right, so when colonists say that they're being enslaved, right, they are correct when they're using that word, enslaved by Parliament, because what they're doing is looking for the most powerful way to offer a juxtaposition to how they feel in the colonies. And what I mean by this is how they are describing what they see as an existential threat to their way of life, the way they live in the colonies. All right? So tonight, we're going to try to hold both of these ideas at the same time. We're going to take the colonists' grievances seriously and ask who is left out in their version of freedom. This tension is something we've grappled with for over the last 250 years in the United States, and I think it's something that we will continue to grapple with, all right? So tonight, to set things off, we're going to go back to pre-1776, all right? And this helps us to understand the conditions, grievances, and ideas that make independence possible. I'm going to ask you guys to do something that I'm consistently asking my students to do, all right? I'm taking you back pre-1776. You guys know what happens in 1776. That does not mean the people living in colonial North America knew that 1776 was coming and it was going to be a big old deal, right? They do not have that insight. They do not have that forethought of what's going to happen, right? We all have hindsight of 2020 is what my mama used to say, and that's what I tell my students, okay? So these folks didn't necessarily know what they were getting themselves into. Push this button here. So let's talk about British colonial North America. All right, so I have some images here: colonial Boston, colonial Philadelphia, and colonial Charleston. These all represent 3 distinct regions of colonial experience. Colonial Boston is in the New England area. Colonial Philadelphia would be considered what we call our middle colonies, and then colonial Charleston is in the southern colonies. What we need to know is that for these folks, independence is not inevitable. All right, this is not an inevitable choice that's going to happen for them. And in fact, most colonists between 1700 and 1763 are, for the most part, very proud British subjects. They enjoy being a part of the colony. They are a part of the empire. This is their life. They connect to it in a very visceral way for some of these folks. So if you had gone, if we could get in the time, what my students like to call the Wayback Machine, right? If we could get in that and just zip back to like 1730 to Boston in 1730 and say, hey guys, you're going to declare independence and you're going to want to not be a part of the British Empire. Well, one, they'd be like, why do you look so funny? And why do you not sound like us? Another thing that my students don't realize is that everyone sounds like British subjects in this time period with a British accent, right? But 2, they'd be like, what are you talking about? We love being a part of the empire. That's bananas. Why would you say these things to us? All right? Independence, therefore, is a product of specific decisions made by specific people under specific pressures. All right? We have 13 diverse colonies. These colonies, before we get to the independence movement, do not necessarily communicate a whole lot, and they don't necessarily see themselves in each other. Okay? And what I mean by that, all right? They have separate geographies, separate climates, separate economies, separate religious backgrounds, and separate ethnic backgrounds. All right, for example, an educated merchant in Boston and a tobacco planter in Virginia had remarkably little in common in this time period, even though they both technically pledged loyalty to the same king. All right. In New England, for example, so that's the first picture. In New England, for example, their experiences are shaped by the Puritan influences that brought those folks to New England. All right, the descendants of the Great Migration, which takes place in the 1630s, so we start seeing pilgrims and all that fun stuff, all those fun people coming across the Atlantic Ocean, will build a culture that prizes literacy, congregational self-government, and a fair sense of what they call a covenant community, which I will talk about at the end of today's lecture, today's talk. Boston, for example, is a thriving commercial center. It retains a deep Calvinist, suspicion, if I can talk correctly, of luxury, and has a deep tradition of civic participation. In New England, town meetings are very important to these folks. These are not mere public gatherings or public institutions. This is a way that communities understand themselves. And again, kind of like bringing to the modern era, I always try to give my students examples of this so they can kind of see it in the modern era. I don't know if any of you guys, it's an older show, TV show called Gilmore Girls. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it. So they're in Connecticut, right? And that show, collectively, you see frequently in that show, they have town meetings where they go in to talk about what's going on in the community and like, should they hire a new whatever, or should they get rid of, they had 2 troubadours at one episode, right? We don't need 2 troubadours in our small town, get rid of one, right? That's what we're talking about, town meetings, right? And we see that expressed even in a show in the 20th century, 21st century, representing kind of this tradition in colonial America. All right? So in our, let me see, make sure I got everything here. So eventually, as Parliament begins to threaten self-governance, this is striking at the heart of the New England sense of life, right? And this is part of the reason that it's going to be a pushback from those New England colonies. The middle colonies represent places like New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. The middle colonies are our most ethnically and religiously diverse areas in the British Atlantic world. All right, so in Pennsylvania specifically, founded by William Penn the Elder, he is a Quaker. He will establish the Pennsylvania colony for a place for Quakers to come and move to, these people who are engaged in nonviolence and pacifism. But we also see that in that same area, we see waves of German settlers, Scotch-Irish immigrants, Welsh Quakers, and dozens of similar smaller communities like the Mennonites, the Lutherans, and the Presbyterians all moving to Pennsylvania. So we see this diversity in that colony. It's not something that's easily described in the stroke of one pen. Also, for example, Philadelphia, by the mid-18th century, was the largest British North America colony were one of the largest British North American cities with one of the most cosmopolitan communities in the entire English-speaking world. So not just in colonial America, but the entire English-speaking world. This is a very diverse community. Just to kind of put a little point on that, famously, Benjamin Franklin of Philadelphia, which by the way, he was actually born in Boston. I don't know if you guys knew that about Ben Franklin, but Ben Franklin and his dad did not get along. He was born in Boston. When he was about 14 or 15 years old, he said, "This is bananas. I hate my dad." They did not get along. And he literally walked from Boston to Philadelphia. It took him a hot minute to get there, but he walked. I tell my students this, they look amazed because they will not walk across campus at UT Tyler. That is a crazy thing to ask of them. Why would you ever ask them to do that? Right? But Ben Franklin, his Philadelphia is a city of printers, merchants, scientists, and tradespeople. This is a diverse, bustling community. All right, and then finally in your southern colonies, we have Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Their economic foundations are entirely different from the other 2 regions. They are agricultural-based societies. Their societies are agricultural-based. By the mid-18th century, Virginia's great planters, talk about the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, the Lees, the Byrds, all dominate Southern colonial society and cultivate this image of a gentleman class farmer. Like we're gentlemen, so kind of refined, and we're farmers. All right, this is very similar to what we see in the Roman tradition. And they view themselves personally, they talk about themselves a lot as being very civic mindedness and having a lot of virtue in the way that they do things and go about things. Their wealth and their ability to have access to leisure and the way that they conceive of independence all rest on the idea of, again, forced labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. And in fact, in 1750, roughly 40% of Virginia's population was enslaved. At that same time, South Carolina's enslaved population actually outnumbered its white population, which was pretty consistent even through the American Civil War. All right, so again, these people are part of the empire. But as I had mentioned before, they're proud to be a part of that empire. All right, most colonial North Americans are enthusiastic about this system. All right, they celebrate the king's birthday. All right, they actually hung portraits of the monarch in their drawing rooms. They read British literature, so people like Samuel Johnson, they would have been reading him. All right, they followed British fashion culture, so they like to dress. Again, something else that's a part of the history of the American past. It doesn't have to be pew, 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 we shot guns at people, right? It's all kinds of stuff. And fashion is one of them. And I've had a few students do research projects on these kinds of things. So they followed that British fashion culture, and they even named their towns in colonial America after British towns in the homeland. All right? So where does this source of British pride come from? Why? Why are you so proud to be British? Well, they have traditions that they see as a part of the British Empire that they view as being better than traditions in other cultures. Number one, trial by jury. They buy into that. A trial by a jury of your peers. They really like this idea. They also like the common law tradition. So that's, again, the English common law tradition, which actually spans all the way back to the founding of the Magna Carta, which is in June, ironically enough, June 15th, today's June 16th, June 15, 1215, right, is when the Magna Carta was established or documented. They also love having a parliament, all right? So most other European powers at this time do not have a parliament. Parliament provides them with representative government, and it also is a bulwark on the power of the monarch, and they like this. And they will often look at themselves and say, look at us. Look how advanced we are. We have representative government. These French people over here, because traditionally British and French people don't get along, these French folks over here, well, they're so backwards. They just have a king, and they just do whatever the king tells them to do, and they have like little fiefdoms, right? But look at us. We have a monarch, and we have a parliament to check power on that monarch. And that makes us special. That's kind of how they're viewing themselves. All right? Also, the British, because of all of those things, they see their rights, as they would call it, as a birthright to that British tradition. And we see this, we're not going to get super into the weeds with it, but when we see the writing of Patrick Henry's Virginia Resolves, essentially, he says, we have the rights of Englishmen as if we were born in England. We have these rights because we are Englishmen, right? Just because we were born in the colonies, that doesn't make us different. We have these rights because of that common law, because of that tradition. All right, so it's the birthright as Englishmen that makes them popular, or makes them this idea popular in this time. So again, the phrase, the rights of Englishmen, will become absolutely central when things start to go sideways in North America. Colonial rejection of taxation is not a desire for independence by any stretch of the imagination. All right, what they're mad about in taxation, we're going to get into it, isn't simply because they want, to not be a part of the empire or anything like that. They're seeing that the empire and that the parliament in England is violating their natural rights as Englishmen. That's the problem. That's the problem. All right. So this is a hugely distinctive and important measure that needs to be taken into account. The other problem is what is later termed by, not in this exact time period, but a little bit later, by, I think he is Scottish, Edmund Burke. He is a thinker, philosopher, statesman, all the things. He wears all the hats, right? But Edmund Burke essentially says what Britain did was engage in North America a phrase that he terms as sultry, I think is how you pronounce it, sultry neglect. And what that basically means is that Britain let the colonies be up to their own devices and do their own thing for far too long. All right? And so historians usually look at this. This is not a policy that the British Parliament and Crown wanted. It was pragmatic for them. And what I mean by that is most people, or most of the time, the colonists are kind of out here literally, so this is the way I imagined it, right? That you have these people who live in England, and then they see the colonists as like their backwoods cousin, right? You know, the backwoods cousins, they're out there doing whatever they're doing, but we got to fight a war with France right now. And we got our own problems domestically going on, and we don't have time to keep Jim Bob in line. Again, I grew up country. I don't know if y'all can tell. I'm from rural East Texas. So we can't keep Jim Bob in line, so we're over here doing our own thing in Britain, and we're just gonna let them go off to their own devices, right? But when that time comes to bring in that power, the colonists aren't really down for that. They're not looking for that, all right? And that's gonna create some of those problems, all right? So this is an intentional policy, but one done by what Edmund Burke referred to as benign in intention by Parliament and the Crown. And this is done for a couple reasons. Again, they have their own issues at home. They're fighting constantly with the French. But also it's very difficult in the 17th and 18th century to control people who live more than 3,000 miles across an ocean from you, right? I usually tell my students, especially when we're talking about the earlier parts of colonies, like when people are just like popping up over here, right? Just to get to the New World takes anywhere from 3 to 4 months, depending on what time you're coming, right? And they're not coming on these massive giant boats that we like to think of. Like these are usually pretty small vessels, and it's kind of a scary, dangerous journey for them to get all the way over here. So to not only get people and literally plant them over in the New World, but then to try to control them, that's a little bit of a problem. All right. We also see that because of this neglect that the colonists experienced, they started self-governing. That's what they did. All right, so we see the rise of colonial assemblies. What I mean by that is the House of Burgesses in Virginia, the oldest of them. The House of Burgesses in Virginia, the General Court in Massachusetts, and the Pennsylvania Assembly are just 3 of the original 13. All right, they practice real political power at the local level, which is something that is not happening for a lot of people in England. And what I mean by that is they are passing local taxes, right? They are also passing local legislation, but the colonists also had other powers that I think a lot of people in our general understanding of this time period forget. The colonists in this time period actually passed and approved through these assemblies the salaries of the royal governors when they were placed in America. So if you were a jerk and not really working with the people that you're working with, like they don't like you, they won't pay you, right? So you have to go along to get along, in a sense, right? So that gives them a lot of leverage here in colonial America, all right? So as a result of this, this results in a politically experienced, institutionally confident people, all right? They know how to run their systems. They know how their systems work. And by the way, this isn't just a year or two that they're doing this. We're talking for some areas like the House of Burgesses, more than 100 years, right? This is a long tradition in colonial North America. All right, so, but there are folks on the outside looking in. There's indigenous people. In 1750, colonial settlements were concentrated along the eastern seaboard, but to the west of them lived dozens of different indigenous nations. For example, the Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. These are not passive bystanders in this colonial experiment, but rather active political players. They're not just out there, like, oh, here's a fish, and let me teach you how to plant some stuff, right? And it's not like they were opposed, or not like they were like, oh, you want my land? Okay, well, I'll just move around and move out of the way, and you can have it, right? So the way they viewed the system and how they viewed land ownership is very different from the British perspective or the European perspective, but it's still definitely there. All right, so they're not passive bystanders, but active political players. They negotiate alliances with the British, the French, and the Spanish. All right, they played European powers against each other a lot, and they fought often to maintain their own self-sovereignty and possession of their land. And then, of course, we have enslaved people who also have their own views about and ideas about liberty, which we'll talk more about in the second lecture, especially their role in helping support the American Revolution. And so that is something to keep kind of in the back of your mind. So that leads us to the tipping point, the 7 Years' War. Oh, well. So it's 1754 to 1763, and I always tell my students, if you can do math, you realize that that's 9 years, not 7 years, right? So in Europe, we call it the 7 Years' War, all right? In America, you've probably heard this, is the French and Indian War. All right, the reason that it has a different timeline is for the first 2 years, it's fought in North America alone. All right, the last 7 years are fought globally, and it's a conflict between the British and the French. A conflict between the British and the French. But what I want you guys to realize is that in reality, this is our First World War. This is the First World War, not the one that happens in 1914. All right, and what I mean by that is this war is fought is a conflict between Britain and France over control of the global trading mechanisms and the empire of the world. This war is fought in the forests of Pennsylvania and New York, but also in the Caribbean, in West Africa, India, the Philippines, and across most major naval theaters of both the Atlantic and the Pacific. So this is not just something that happens in North America or just in Europe. All right. In North America, though, it is specifically a dispute over what we call the Ohio River Valley, which is this area here. All right. So essentially, what is happening is that you have, you see here it says New France. The French are moving their way into the Ohio River Valley, and what they're trying to do is build a series of connecting forts or outposts that will connect all through the Ohio River Valley to the Mississippi River to New Orleans, to Louisiana. All right. So that's what they're trying to do. And by trying to do that, what they're also ultimately trying to do, because remember, the British and the French are always fighting, they're trying to keep the British close to the coast, right? So kind of hemming them in along the coast, right? So if we can do this process, that's the idea at least. All right? So attempting to hem the British in. This will upset a lot of folks, but specifically, because you notice it's up in here, Virginia and Virginia land speculators, including this guy, maybe you've heard of him, George Washington. All right, so you have these land speculators who like to go out here and kind of set up claim land or establish like a settlement and then move people in and kind of sell off land. A land speculator, exactly what you think it means, exactly what you think it means. All right, so in 1754, young Lieutenant Colonel George Washington is going, and you can see it here, George Washington is going to make his way into the Ohio River Valley, and he will encounter along his way, he's actually trying to go to Fort Duquesne, which is right here. He's going to try to go that way, but he will be ambushed, and in that ambush, he will build a fort out of necessity, which he calls Fort Necessity. And then after a hot minute, he is going to surrender Fort Necessity, and in that surrender, that becomes the basis for what we know in American history as the French and Indian War, or for European history, the 7 Years' War. All right? But what we see here is as this war starts to develop, and especially the longer it plays on, initially speaking, Britain struggles. They're not doing so great. The British have a couple of problems. One, they don't like to listen to colonial people. All right, for example, we have Edward Braddock a year later. All right, Edward Braddock shows up with a bunch of tanks. He likes heavy artillery. George Washington says to him, "You will not be able to drag this heavy artillery through the Appalachian Mountains and be successful." And Edward Braddock says, "I know what I'm doing. I'm British and a general. What do you know?" So they make their way up here into the Appalachian Mountains. They get surrounded by a group of indigenous people. They are attacked by those indigenous people. They have to, Washington, who's the guide, has to organize a fighting retreat back into Virginia. Edward Braddock dies. And typically, in my longer classes, I have a picture of Edward Braddock's, a painting, obviously they didn't have cameras, a painting of Edward Braddock's dead body on top of this heavy artillery being dragged back into Virginia because he didn't listen. Right? And George Washington tried to tell him, that's not going to work, but we're going to do it anyway because he knows better, right? So that is the ambush here that's going to end Braddock's life. We also see that in his early years, we see lessons learned. Two important lessons. One, it reveals that a European style of fighting is not going to work in the Appalachian mountain ranges. And what I mean by that is, again, like to reference movies, if you guys have seen the movie The Patriot, right? Or any movie about the American Civil War. They line up in front of each other, or even Braveheart, like well before this, right? Line up in front of, and then just start shooting and go like this. That does not work in the Appalachian Mountains. That's a terrible idea. All right, so we see that that's one lesson learned. European warfare is not possible in the forest. But the second thing is, we see tensions being risen between the British regulars and the colonial militia. All right, that's when we start to see these militiamen fighting alongside the colonial regulars, or the British regulars rather. They do not like the colonists. Again, see them as backwards. These old podunk kids back here. What are y'all doing? Trying to tell us what to do? You don't know stuff. And for the colonists, as you can imagine, that is offensive to them. And especially for people who grew up in this area, who maybe had spent time hunting and trapping and fighting in these woods, and know this terrain, and know these people, and know what's going on. To be put aside as somebody who's just ignorant and stupid, you don't know anything, is very offensive for these folks. All right? Let's also talk about the role of native peoples. Often when we talk about this time period, the French and Indian War, is just like, oh, the British fought against the French and the Indians, and that was it. And it makes the story of the indigenous population very flat or very one-sided, right? It is much more complicated than that. I wrote down how to pronounce it. It's the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, all right, which is a six-nation Iroquois alliance, had spent decades playing French and British interest against one another, which gained that alliance specifically trade concessions, military support, and political recognition from both sides. You also have in this area what they call the Ohio Country nations, which include the Delaware, the Shawnee, and the Mingo. They also have been pushing back on colonial land in what they call encroachment, or saw as encroachment. Initially, the Ohio Country folks, and you can see here, Ohio Country, the Ohio Country folks are going to side with the French. Not because they loved the French, but they thought the French was less invasive to their personal lives. And what I mean by this is, for the most part, the French are not looking to set up major colonies. They're not out here trying to expand colonies like that. They're looking for out-trading posts so that they could work with indigenous people or by themselves to gather up furs and then trade those along the trade routes to get those furs back to Europe, right? Whereas the British are establishing towns, right? And often they're bringing their religion with them and they're trying to get indigenous folks to buy into that religion. The French aren't really doing that. The French are much more, I hate to say it, they're like transactional in their accounts with the indigenous folks. All right? So as a result of the support from the Ohio Country nations, their support directly resulted in some of the British struggles that we see early on in the war or in the conflict. Also, that includes the attack of Braddock's mission, because these warriors know the terrain and they knew how to move through it in ways that European armies simply could not. But we do see a turning point in the war. And the turning point is when a member of parliament, his name is William Pitt the Elder. So back then they didn't have seniors and juniors, they had the elder and the younger. All right, so William Pitt the Elder, he is essentially going to become the overseer of the war. All right, and he decides that he's going to flip the script a little bit. And what I mean by that is he will send money and men to North America. He's putting all chips in on defeating the French in North America. He thinks that if we can defeat the French in North America, we will win this war. He's right. Okay? But he didn't know that yet, but he's right. All right, so he sends folks in to British North America. He also uses the British Navy, which is the most powerful navy in the world at the time, to stymie French trade along the Atlantic and the Pacific. All right, but William Pitt is also going to appeal to the colonists in a way that had never been done before. So I told you already that the British regulars treat the colonists as like these backwood hicks, right? People in England think of them that way too. They're like, these guys. William Pitt is the first member of Parliament on the floor of Parliament to talk about what he calls colonial rights. He's the guy who introduces that idea to Parliament and puts it in the records of Parliament, right? So he's the first to kind of talk about the colonists as having rights, all right? But he also promises that, so previous to Pitt, the Crown and Parliament essentially expected colonies to help pay for the war up front, right? Well, he says to the colonists, if you guys help pay for the war, we will reimburse you. We're going to give you some of your money back. And the colonists are like, oh, I like that idea. And they like the idea that their rights are being talked about, because they see themselves as part of the British Empire and a part of that system. And this guy's representing us and saying, or not necessarily representing us, but saying what we already think on the floor of Parliament. That's a big deal for them. So the colonists, we actually see a huge uptick in enlistment in colonial militia after William Pitt takes over. And so the colonists are going to buy in, all right? But again, as these British soldiers are fighting alongside these colonists, we're seeing that chafing of mutual contempt between the two. We will eventually see British victories. So in 1758, we see victories at both Louisburg and Fort Duquesne. So Fort Duquesne will fall. All right, that is modern day Pittsburgh. It gets renamed after a guy, maybe you've heard of him, William Pitt the Elder. All right, the colonists renamed that area for him. So that's where Pittsburgh comes from in Pennsylvania. We also see Canadian settlements start to fall. In 1759, Quebec falls in dramatic fashion. We see that the British general leading his troops there, his name is James Wolfe. They will scale the cliffs to get to the encampment of the French. They do this under the cover of darkness, and they defeat the French on what is known as the Plains of Abraham. Both Wolfe and the Marquis de Montcalm, who is the French general, die in that battle. In 1760, the British defeat the French in Montreal, and by 1763, we see the signing of the Peace of Paris, or the Treaty of Paris, 1763. There's 1,000,000 pieces of Paris. Oh, we go back. My bad. All right. Yeah, so we see the Treaty of Paris, 1763. This officially ends the 7 Years' War / French and Indian War. But what we also see is this: France cedes almost all of its territorial claims to Britain, and then the British will maintain control of basically the eastern half of the North American continent after this treaty. All right, but I don't know if you guys know this: war, it's expensive. All right, war is very expensive, and in fact, what we see is that the British debt is going to roughly double during the time of the conflict. So before the conflict, it was estimated at about 72 million pounds was the British debt. After the conflict, 130 million pounds, okay, in 9 years. Also, administering new lands, which include Canada, parts of Florida, and all of the territory from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, requires soldiers, garrisons, officials to govern it, and courts to administer it. Very important, very expensive. All right, so Parliament believed, since this benefits the colonies, they see this as a win for the colonies. The colonists won. We got rid of the French for you guys, right? So you should, out of the goodness of your heart, want to pay back all this debt. And the colonists are like, hey, wait a minute, I thought you were going to pay us what we pay. Like, we don't understand. This doesn't make sense to us. All right? Britain doesn't have the resources needed to gain or to maintain this territory. And again, that mutual contempt between British regulars and colonial militiamen continue to bubble up. I don't know if I have it on here. I do. Excellent. All right. So almost immediately, we see another war. And this war is specifically over the Ohio River Valley, the territory we just saw Britain and France fighting over. But this time, this war is between indigenous groups, that Iroquois Alliance, and we see specifically Pontiac. He's an Ottawa war chief who led coordinated uprisings in this area of the Ohio River Valley and in the region of the Great Lakes against the British. He is not the only one, but he kind of gets credit for it, which is why it's called Pontiac's War. And so within months of this, starting of these little incursions here by indigenous groups, we see that the British are going to be very greatly harmed. Almost all British posts west of the Appalachian Mountains had been attacked, and several had fallen. Hundreds of British settlers had been killed, and British regulars who were still in the area are ill prepared to fight in this war. So to solve this, we see what's called the Proclamation of 1763. So essentially what the Proclamation of 1763 does is this dark brown line. And it says to folks, all right, that the crest of the Appalachian Mountains is going to be a boundary line, and you can have no colonial settlement west of the line. Now remember, about 10 years before this, the argument was we got to go fight British people or French people over there so that we can have this territory that's rightfully ours. Let's go fight. We engage in that war, we fight that war, we win that war, and now you're telling us, oh, you can't go over there, right? You can't be over there, all right? The British argue it's the line is to stabilize the frontier, reduce colonial conflict with native peoples, and provide Parliament with time to organize newly acquired territory. The British subjects, on the other hand, say, you're trying to control us, and we don't like it. We fought our brothers, our sons, our husbands, our cousins, aunts, well, uncles. They all fought for that territory. Now you're saying we can't go over there? We were told this is why we had to fight this war. We sacrificed, and now you want to control us. So there's that tension again, right? There's that tension about, oh, now you're telling us where to go. And I remember once had a professor explain it like this. He said, they're saying, oh, we're going to protect you from indigenous people. And the people of Virginia especially, who've been governing under the House of Burgesses since 1619. That's when the House of Burgesses are created. They've been self-governing since 1619. And in between, not only self-governing since 1619, but also dealing with indigenous groups since before that. Now you want to protect us from indigenous people? What are you talking about? As long as 150 years. This is crazy for these folks, right? They do not buy into this argument. They do not buy into this argument. All right? So, this is going to create anger and fury, and yet, again, the British, or the colonists seeing this as a way to control them. As I mentioned to you guys a minute ago, the war is expensive. All right? And so now we come from this idea of taxation. A lot of my students think, oh, we didn't want to be taxed. We didn't believe in taxes. Not true. Absolutely not true at all. All right? It is more complicated than that. Everything is more complicated than that. All right? So the root of the disagreement is both sides are operating from two different standpoints and understandings of how empire works and how the British Empire specifically works. Parliament sees themselves as the sovereign legislative body. We win all the time, period. That's it, right? They will say that they have the responsibility to legislate for all of British subjects everywhere, including those who are in the colonies. And when Parliament passes a tax, that is the final word, and it is true for people living in Britain and people living in Boston, right? This is us. We have the right to do this, all right? They reject this idea of this colonial representation in Parliament. They said that for these folks, that's impractical. Why? Why would you have colonial representation in Parliament? Well, one, you're 3,000 miles away. That's really far to come here when we're having parliamentary meetings. But two, fun fact, many British cities did not have parliamentary representation in Parliament, right? They didn't have a direct representative in Parliament. So for them, they feel like that is a moot point. They, in fact, embrace what they like to call virtual representation, i.e. Parliament represents the interest of all British citizens, and by being a member of the British Empire or a British subject, your interests are being represented. That's kind of how they're describing it. The colonial perspective, on the other hand, was not good. They thought that this argument was inconceivable, and they were insulted at the notion of virtual representation, especially since most of them had been practicing direct representation at home for over a century. All right, so they are not so happy. All right, colonial folks are saying that this virtual representation is a farce designed to justify you guys taking our money without our consent, right? To taking resources from us without us having any kind of consent. And they actually refer to the English constitutional tradition, which was free men, this is how they refer to it, free men are only taxed by the legislature in which they or their chosen representatives actually seat or sat. So the idea of no taxation with representation is not just a slogan, it's not just a bumper sticker, or I had a student once say, it's like the movie poster tagline. That's not exactly what it is, right? For them, it is much more than that. It is much more than that. This is at the basis of English principle and liberty, right? What it means to be free is being violated to these colonists. All right, this isn't simply an argument over money, but in their opinion, an argument about the nature of sovereignty itself. All right, which leads us to one of the first, it's not the first, all right, again, highlights. So we'll go with the Stamp Act of 1765. So essentially, the Stamp Act would require folks to pay a wide range of taxes on printed materials that were often seen in the colonies, including newspapers, legal documents, pamphlets, almanacs, and even playing cards. This is passed in Parliament under Prime Minister, make sure I say his name, George Grenville. All right, and for him, he thought this was not a bad thing. It's a modest tax, and he's not wrong, compared to what British citizens are paying in England. Right, this is a smaller tax. So he's like, they'll grumble. This is exactly what he's saying. They'll grumble about it, but it'll be all right. It was not all right. It was definitely not all right. All right? And specifically, this tax impacts people like lawyers, printers, and merchants, which are your most educated, politically connected, and publicly influential people in colonial society. Probably not the people you want to piss off. All right? These are not people who will suffer in silence. So we see pushback. Within weeks, colonial newspapers are feeling, editors are filling their newspapers with furious they're denouncing the Stamp Act. Can't talk right. All right? Pamphlets are circulating, arguing the constitutional case against parliamentary taxation. Patrick Henry, who I referenced earlier, introduces the Virginia Resolves in the House of Burgesses against the Stamp Act. We see street protests erupt in Boston, or across the colony, but in Boston specifically. That's what you're looking at here, right? So they're hanging people in effigy. They are marching through the streets. They are not happy. But in addition to this Stamp Act, this is Brandy's favorite story. So at the time, the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, his name is Thomas Hutchinson. All right, Thomas Hutchinson, as Lieutenant Governor, gets to appoint the stamp collector in Boston. He decides to appoint his brother-in-law, so no nepotism there, Andrew Oliver. All right, so Andrew Oliver is making his way to Boston. The Sons of Liberty, you guys probably heard of him, or them, the Sons of Liberty are really riled up. So they decide to go to the stamp collecting office and protest, which basically means doing what you see here, rebel rousing in the streets. All right, they will do this rebel rousing, and then they try to, nobody's there, so they break into the stamp collecting office and they literally tear it to the ground. And then they go marching through the streets, and it makes me think of the scene from Beauty and the Beast, where they're like on a, with the pitchforks, like, right, that's what they're doing, marching through the streets of Boston, and they're going to go to the place in which Andrew Oliver is supposed to be living. They get there, he's not there. And they're like, we're going to tear that house down too. The neighbor is the landowner. He runs out, he goes, I agree with you guys, please don't tear my house down. Yeah. And he says, let me take you to the pub and we'll talk about it. So he fills them up for a little food and beer, right? And the next day they wake up and they're so pissed off still that they decide to go get Thomas Hutchinson. So they go to his house, right? And Thomas Hutchinson was a waif of a man, right? So they get to the Thomas Hutchinson's house, and when they get there, he's not there. They break in, they liberate his liquor cabinet. They tear down his house. They steal anything of value, like silver, because back then silver was literally made of silver, so they're taking that kind of stuff, burning his books, they're destroying this man's house. But Brandy's favorite story, and she and I heard it when we were in grad school, is the old waif of Thomas Hutchinson, this guy. He says in his diary that he was going to stay and face the crowd. Now remember, this is the Sons of Liberty. And the people who are in the Sons of Liberty are going to be like your ship workers, like dock workers, shipbuilders, people who make ropes, burly kind of folks, right? And Thomas Hutchinson, waif of a man, he says in his diary, I was going to stand my ground, but my youngest daughter said, but father, please don't stay and die. And he said, okay, and got in the car and left with his family when they escaped. All right? But things aren't going great. So you can see here, this is what the stamp was supposed to look like. All right? So we see protests in the streets, but we also see this is another form of protest here, where people would actually draw in a skull and crossbones where the stamp was supposed to go. And so they were saying, no, we're not going to collect this stamp. Not only do we see rebel rousing in the streets, but we also see something else important, which is in October of 1765, members of 9 of the colonies came together and issued a joint statement on their rights and their grievances. And that is what we call the Stamp Act Congress. So we see them starting to collectively work together, bound together in opposition to what Parliament is doing. On November 1st, 1765, incidentally enough, that's when the Stamp Act was supposed to go into effect, and suddenly no one in the colonies was willing to collect the stamp. So it essentially didn't go into effect. Parliament will repeal the Stamp Act, mostly though, not because of the colonists being rebel-rousing, but because colonists, in addition to rebel-rousing, agreed to boycotting of British goods. And that hurts the economic aspect of the merchants, British merchants. They complained to Congress, they complained to Parliament, Parliament repeals the Stamp Act. When Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, they do pass something called the Declaratory Act, which basically says Parliament is supreme in all matters. The colonists kind of overlooked that. They were just like, yay, no more Stamp Act, we're excited about life. Not thinking about the Declaratory Act. In 1767, in 1767, we see that Parliament will once again come together. We have a new Chancellor of the Exchequer. His name is Charles Townshend, and they pass what is collectively known as the Townshend Acts. All right, one of them is a tea tax. Now, what's interesting here is that Townshend thought, well, okay, well, these colonists are upset at what they called an internal tax. And what an internal tax is, taxes on activities within the colonies. So we're just going to pass taxes now that we call external taxes. All right, and so those are taxes on imported goods from Britain into the colonies. All right, this could be on things like paper, glass, lead, paint, and of course tea. But there are colonial objections. In Pennsylvania, one of the most noted members of the what later will become the Patriots is John Dickinson. He's a lawyer. John Dickinson famously published a series of essays called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. In these essays, which are reprinted, his essays are reprinted in newspapers all along the 13 colonies. They're all reprinting these. All right? Dickinson argues that there's a distinction. Yes, there is a distinction between internal and external taxes, but that's irrelevant. He argued that the real issue is with Parliament's purpose. And what he means by that, import duties to regulate trade are legitimate. You're regulating trade, you can pass taxes for that. To collect revenue, not legitimate. That's the difference. All right? So we start seeing colonial boycotts resuming. Women will be very active in this. They join what is known as the Daughters of Liberty. These are various organizations along the 13 colonies where they start doing what we call homespun cloth. So they're spinning their own cloth, so they don't have to buy British cloth. Right? They start brewing their own tea substitutes based off stuff that they can either get in the colonies themselves or buying substitute tea, i.e. illegal tea from the Dutch. Right? So they're doing these kinds of things on their own. We do see British pushback, and the situation in Boston is especially tense. In 1768, British troops, also a part of the Townshend Act, will be stationed in colonial Boston. It is through what we know as the Quartering Act. Typically, the way it worked is if you were a part of this rebel-rousing group known as the Sons of Liberty, and the way they knew, as I always tell my students, they don't wear like jerseys or uniforms. It's like, oh, Sons of Liberty, right? But if you see protests, right, the royal officials aren't stupid, right? If you see protests and the same people keep showing up to the protest, they're probably in the Sons of Liberty. So what you would do is you would say, okay, well, through the Quartering Act, you have to house a British soldier. But not only do you have to house a British soldier, you have to feed a British soldier. And that's a very very key distinction. And what we mean by that is British soldiers have to eat a certain kind of diet, which is often, like, for example, you have to have so many eggs in the morning for breakfast, so much like pork or beef or whatever, usually a bread, juice. Like, you're eating way better than what normal, like, average people are eating. Right, so you're going to run up their bills, right? Like, because you have to pay for this person. And if you keep participating, we'll put 2 British soldiers, and they require beds, right? So for the most part, in these colonial homes, the nicest piece of your furniture would have been your bed. And if you have children, they sleep on smaller beds, right? But under the Quartering Act, the British soldier gets the nicest bed, the biggest bed. And if you have 2 soldiers, well, now you need 2 big beds. Most people do not have 2 big beds. So this is problematic, all right? So the British use of quartering under the Townshend Acts is going to put even more intense pressure in the city of Boston. Some of the stuff I've read is that if you were a colonial soldier, you didn't go anywhere in Boston by yourself because you were just walking around by yourself. Somebody's going to pull you into the alley and beat the mess out of you. Also, if you were a British or a colonial man, you didn't go anywhere in the city of Boston by yourself, because a group of British soldiers might pull you into an alley and beat the mess out of you. There's no love lost between these folks. All right? So we do see this is causing some tension. And then we're going to lead to the Boston Massacre, which you guys have probably heard of. This is on March 5th, 1770. I do like to point out, though, so this is where the mass grave of the Boston Massacre victims are at. But notice that there's a young boy here. His name is Christopher Snyder. He actually died in February of 1770, so about 2 weeks, 11 days before the Boston Massacre. There was some more rebel rousing going on in front of a loyalist merchant who was a loyalist. And this guy came out who was also a loyalist and shot into the crowd and shot this boy and killed him. That guy will actually get arrested and tried in Boston. But then he's given a royal pardon and moved up higher in the ranks of the British government outside of Boston. And so if you're a British colonist living in Boston, you're not happy. Things are not going great. So on March 5th, 1770, things aren't going great. You have this building here. It still stands today. It's called the Old State House. At the time, it was the State House / Customs House here on King Street in Boston. I encourage you to go visit it. But they're standing out there, and there's the story goes there's at least one young British guard. By the way, these British guards were probably anywhere from 15 to 18 years old. All right, it was not uncommon for the British to do, lost my word, where they would basically go around in the empire. Ms. York, you may remember what I'm talking about.
They get press games?
Yeah, impressments. Yeah, so it's an impressment. So what that means is the British need soldiers. Well, they'll just go into a town and be like, all right, we need 5, and just grab 5 people, and now you're in the British Army. That's your life, right? Like, you didn't sign up, you didn't enlist. So there's, the way historians think, there's probably like a 15 or 16-year-old kid, initially by himself, standing in front of the Old North Church, or not the Old North Church, the Old State House. Just the State House there. And a group of people are in the crowd, and they start throwing snowballs at this soldier. And from what I understand from folks who live in New England, when you're throwing snowballs at people you don't like, it's not just a snowball. They put ice, rocks, glass, like anything that can hurt in the snowball, and they throw them at you. Right, so he calls for his buddies to come out, and a group of folks come out, and you can see them all here lined up. All right, in the crowd that day were dock workers, sailors, apprentices, and other townspeople. We don't know definitively what happened, but essentially shots are fired into the crowd. And when those shots are fired, 5 colonists are dead or dying. One of the first to fall was a black man named Crispus Attucks. He was of African and indigenous descent. Later, John Adams, so famous second president of the United States, described the crowd here in Boston as a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes, Irish teagues, and outlandish jack tars. That's kind of how he described these people. All right? So the Boston Massacre occurs. All right? You can see it here. This is how we remember the Boston Massacre. And I always ask my students, what does it take to be a massacre? Is 5 people dying really a massacre? And most of my students are like, that doesn't make sense. But it's the emotion behind it that counts. Right? So, you guys may have heard of him. Paul Revere, the Midnight Ride guy that we'll talk about in the second lecture. He was a silversmith, a bell maker, and an artist. He made this engravement. All right, so you can see here, this engravement, and it gets reprinted across the colonies. But it's not just Paul Revere. You can see here, the Bloody Massacre. That's where the term massacre comes from, right? But in Boston itself, within a week, we have Reverend John Lathrop preaching in Boston, and his sermon is entitled, let me see, I have it here, it's easier. Innocent blood crying to God from the streets of Boston. Right? So it's that idea, right, that emotion that gets behind these folks that are so wounded by the Boston Massacre. Because of after the Boston Massacre, not really because, we see that Parliament will repeal most of the Townshend Acts, except for the tax on tea. And mainly, they left the tax on tea as a matter of principle. They're attempting to discriminate or to demonstrate that Parliament had authority to tax the colonists, which leads us to our next tax, which is the Tea Act. which you guys are probably familiar with. So there's this company called the East India Tea, or the East India Company, and they import tea from India and from Asia to the New World and to Britain. Unfortunately for them, they are doing this in a time when they have no money and they are on the verge of bankruptcy. So Parliament, who has an interest in this company, decides, hey, we'll throw you a bone and we'll say that you are the exclusive provider of tea to the colonies. And Parliament actually thought, we're doing them a solid, because as I mentioned, they're getting tea from the Dutch, and it's a contraband item, so it costs more. This is actually going to cost them less. But the other problem is, when people are importing tea into the colonies, they're going through a middleman, a local merchant. This eliminates the local merchant. So all of those people now have lost their business. Not super excited about it. All right? So this is causing a problem. But again, Parliament thought that they were doing them a favor. Not only were colonial merchants furious at being undercut by Parliament, but most colonists thought this was a trap. And what I mean by that was, if we buy their tea, then they're going to say, hey, look, you've consented to us taxing you, and they don't want to consent to that. So most people are protesting the tea. All right, and there's actually multiple tea parties, not just in Boston, but Boston's the fun one. So we see that these ships, I think there were 3 at the time, are full of tea in the harbor, just sitting there. And they've been sitting there for a hot minute. And the now governor of Massachusetts, the royal governor, is Thomas Hutchinson. Thomas Hutchinson passes a decree that says that tea must be unloaded, and if it's not unloaded, now the ship captains have to pay a penalty every day that it sits there. The ship captains work with the Sons of Liberty and say, look, we are not in this fight, right? We are business people and working class folks just like y'all, right? We're not the people in England you're mad at, and now it's going to cost us money. And the Sons of Liberty say, well, we can't just let you unload the tea because we're making a protest here. So we see here the Boston Tea Party, where a group of folks will board these ships. On December 16th, 1773, the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 ships in the Boston Harbor and methodically destroyed 342 chests of East India Company tea. They were methodical and no one was injured. Yes, some people did dress up like Mohawk Indians. All right, why? Why would they dress up like Mohawk Indians? To shift the blame, or plausible deniability. You see all these people out here? They know those people over there, right? Also, not to be offensive, I do not look like somebody of indigenous descent. Most of these people do not look like somebody of indigenous descent. I can put on an outfit, that doesn't make me look like I'm indigenous, right? But if I put on an outfit and go into the bank and rob it, which I am not going to do, but if I did, right after I left here, y'all would be like, oh, that looks like Rhys. But let's say I said, oh, I'm going to share like you're in on it with me, or you wanted me to go rob that bank because, forget you, Austin Bank, that's how I use bank, right? Forget you, Austin Bank, I'm going to go rob them, right? And y'all also maybe hate Austin Bank, I don't know. If the police come talk to y'all and say, who robbed the bank? They're like, I don't know. Looks like somebody in disguise to me. I dress like Zorro. Look like Zorro. Y'all knew it wasn't Zorro. They know it's not Zorro, right? But it gives them plausible deniability. Okay, and this is a peaceful protest in Boston towards to Parliament. Unfortunately, the Boston Tea Party, the Tea Party actually delighted a lot of radical folks across the colonies, but it horrified some more moderate people. For example, Benjamin Franklin, who we talked about earlier. Ben Franklin, who was in London at the time, suggested that the East India Company should be reimbursed by the colonies for this act, right? He did not like it. George Washington spoke out against this because he didn't support the violation or the destruction of personal property. So those are 2 key figures that we think of as our founding fathers speaking out against the tea acts, or the destruction of the tea. Because of this act, we see, or this event, not act, because of the Boston Tea Party, we see passing what's called the Intolerable Acts, which take place in the spring of 1774. Those are the Boston Port Act, where Parliament closes the port of Boston until that tea is repaid. This is devastating for the people of Boston, since most of them get their business and their industry through commerce through the port, whether that's shipping or fishing or anything or all of the above. Next, we see Parliament passing what is known as the Massachusetts Government Act, which suspends the colonial charter to Massachusetts, abolishes the upper house of their legislative assembly, and restricts town meetings, so does not allow those to happen, and gives the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, even more power. We also see what is known as the Administration of Justice Act. Any royal official who is involved in an incident in colonial Massachusetts now will have their trial heard in Britain rather than in Boston. This is problematic for a couple of reasons. This is really problematic for John Adams. I didn't tell you the story, but John Adams actually represented the soldiers at the Boston Massacre, and he got them off on the charges. John Adams' cousin is Sam Adams, who's from the wealthier side of the family. Sam Adams has consistently been trying to get John Adams to join the Patriot cause. But John Adams says he values the law above all else. After the passing of the Administration of Justice Act, because Parliament says, well, British people can't get a fair trial in Massachusetts. And he literally is saying, what about when like 3 years ago, I got you guys a fair trial. This is inflammatory to him. Also, if you think about it this way, if you're a British official and you're committing crimes in colonial Boston, and all your trials have to take place in London, right? That means the accuser has to fund their own way to London to stand and testify against you in the court. What are the likelihoods you could afford that? Which means that you're making a case that British officials can do whatever they want in colonial Massachusetts. We see a strengthening of the Quartering Act, and then there's a fifth one that kind of gets lumped in with the Intolerable Acts. It's not technically a part of them, but it's called the Quebec Act. So we started this lecture with the Ohio River Valley, right? We fought the French to take control of that territory. Then you put this little line that said we couldn't go live in that territory. I promise there's a through line here. All right? Through the Quebec Act, the people living in the Quebec colony, which are people of French descent, now have control of the Ohio River Valley. They're administering the Ohio River Valley. Remember that place, colonists, that we told you couldn't move to? We told you had to fight for it, but we're not going to let you go live there. You don't get to administer it. The French people in Quebec get to administer it. But not only that, in the Quebec Act, it also allows for, let me read this part for you, guaranteed religious freedoms for French Canadian Catholics, which is especially egregious to Protestant New Englanders. They do not like this at all. All right? This is a problem for these folks. All right? As a result of the Intolerable Acts, Parliament sees it on their side as that they are making an example of Massachusetts, trying to demonstrate that defiance has consequences, but your actual consequences are these acts will unite the colonists. Other colonies will send food and supplies to the blockaded city of Boston. The House of Burgesses in Virginia will declare a day of fasting and prayer in solidarity for Boston. We see groups that are called committees of correspondence, which have existed well before this time period, which is how all this information and news and thoughts are traveling. Committees of correspondences, those networks will light up with messages of outrage of the British Crown and support for Massachusetts. The people who are the thinkers of this time period believe that if they can do this to, they being Britain, can do this to Massachusetts, you better believe they can do it to New York, to Virginia, to Maryland, etc., etc., etc. This is a problem. As a result of this, the Continental Congress will meet in September of 1774. 12 of the 13 colonies will set representatives. They're still not on the verge of independence yet, but they are talking about collective action, collective rights, and collective resistance. Here they will issue the Declaration of Colonial Rights. They organize yet another boycott of British goods, and they agreed to meet the following spring if their demands were not heard. So this is what's leading us to the American Revolution. One last thing I want to leave you guys with is the intellectual part of it. Okay, so you have these guys who are a part of these movements, right? And they're communicating with one another, but they're also reading a lot, and specifically John Locke. All right, now John Locke wrote what's famously referred to, he wrote two of them. It's called Treatises on Government, which were published in 1689. All right, and in those treatises on government, he talks about the state of nature. And in that, he says that rights don't come from government. Government doesn't give you rights. You just have rights, right? You have rights to certain natural rights, which he called life, liberty, and property. okay, which should sound pretty familiar to you because our old boy, as I like to refer to him in my class, TJ, Thomas Jefferson, plagiarized a little bit. Just a little tiny bit, but he plagiarized old John Locke, right? So you had them. But then you would say, well, why would you even have a government? Why do we have a government if we live in this natural state? And according to John Locke, he believes that as a society, we enter into what we call a social contract. And what that social contract means is that people give up some of their natural freedoms for the security that comes along with being in a society. But that doesn't mean the government gets to be all willy-nilly and do whatever they want. All right? In fact, he says government is there to protect your natural rights. And if government fails to do so, it has become tyrannical. And then the people have a duty to overthrow or resist tyranny. All right, Locke is complicated, just like these other guys we started at the beginning of the semester, what I'm saying, my students, the beginning of today, right? He argues about natural rights and human liberty, yet he also had shares in the Royal African Company, which means he made money off the enslavement of Africans and the movement of enslaved people across the ocean, okay? But everything is complicated. Everything is complicated. Also in the Enlightenment era, we see the spreading of ideas, and these ideas need a way to circulate. It is the infrastructure for resistance, all right? And the infrastructure for resistance in America is the printing press. This is hugely important. Fun fact, by the mid-18th century, there are newspapers in every colonial city. Papers circulated locally, but also between colonies through those committees of correspondence. Literacy in North America is far outpacing literacy in Britain. All right, people in America, they're reading, and they're reading a lot. All right, colonial America has a higher rate of literacy than almost anywhere else in the world. Not just Britain, in the world. Part of that goes back to the Puritan New England tradition. There's a Puritan tradition that you're supposed to read the Bible yourself. As a result of that, they teach people how to read. And then they invest in education. They invest in colleges, which is where you get Harvard College. They invest in local education. People know how to read, all right? So this is going to produce an unusually high literacy rate in colonial America. We also see that these, not only do we need printing presses, but we need places to share those ideas on a one-to-one basis. All of my students now are all on the internet all the time. You need to meet people in person to have real debates and real conversations. You can say a whole lot behind a computer that you would never say to somebody's face, right? But public houses serve this. So public houses / taverns, they're not just a place for people to go get smashed. This is actually a place for people to share ideas. But not only are they sharing ideas, you see the intersection of different classes, different backgrounds. Everyone goes to the public house, whether you're the wealthiest person in the colony or the poorest person in the colony. You're all there, and you're all allowed to have communities there. And they built those communities. And then pamphlets, as I mentioned before, hugely important because pamphlets are actually a lot cheaper to print than newspapers. They're cheaper and easier to print, easier to distribute. This is, in fact, most historians consider the pamphlet to be the most important political medium of the era. Some of our significant pamphlets include John Dickinson's Letter from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and James Otis's The Rights of the British Colonies and Asserted and Proved. All right, so who's left out of this picture? All right, so I wrote it down so that I could say it right. So there are people who are left out of this American narrative, right, that we've kind of talked about and set up for you today. There is a version of the American Revolution that is clean, heroic, and uncomplicated. In that version, a united people rose up against tyranny. They fought for the principles they believed in, and they built a nation on the foundations of liberty and self-government. And that version is not exactly wrong, but it's also very incomplete. And one of those things that this lecture series, marking the 250th anniversary of the United States, owes its audience is an honest accounting of what's included in that revolutionary vision of freedom and who was not. This is not an exercise in tearing down the founders. Hopefully you guys have picked this up. These are humans. Humans make mistakes. These are not mythological figures that are flawless, but rather it's an exercise in taking them seriously, serious enough to examine the full dimensions of the world that they made and the contradictions that they embedded in it. The revolution produced genuine and lasting achievements, but also produces some injustices. Holding both of these things is not a political position, but simply history done honestly. All right, so history done honestly. And let me finish. I have one more thing. Oh, so our 4 people that we're going to talk about more in depth on the next lecture. Loyalists. Not everyone in the colonies was like, yay, revolution. And in fact, historians guesstimate that about 33 or a third of the American colonists were in fact loyalists. And they did not have a great time, especially after the American Revolution. Another third were probably hardcore patriots, and then the last third were people who were kind of like fence sitters, right? Like whoever's winning at the time, that's the side they support, right? That's kind of how they worked. There are enslaved people that we're going to talk about who are participating in the revolution. By 1776, there's approximately, historians estimate, at 500,000 enslaved people living in the United States, or North America, which will later become the United States, which is roughly 20% of the overall population. All right, and then we have patriots. How do they feel about enslavement, right? Thomas Jefferson recognizes the problem, all right? He just doesn't know how to deal with the problem, right? So he acknowledges often that there is a contradiction in his argument. He just doesn't know how to get there, right? So I think that's important to remember these people. And then, of course, there are indigenous people who are, and women who are participating in the movement. So what do these groups tell us? Loyalists, enslaved people, indigenous nation, women, what do they have in common? They are not incidental to the American Revolution. They're not unfortunate exceptions to an otherwise admirable story. They're evidence of something structural, that the vision of liberty and that the founders had was from the beginning a partial vision. It was a vision of liberty for propertied men. And that was built a lot on the labor of enslaved people, but also the labor of women, and also the labor of indigenous people participated in all these labor structures. So there is tension there. That is a hard thing to say, and it's important to say it carefully. It does not mean that the founders were uniquely evil by standards of their time. Most were not. It does not mean that the ideas that they proclaimed were hollow. They were not. And the ideas that would eventually be claimed by the very people the founders excluded. The abolitionist movement, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, all of those draw on the language of the Declaration of Independence to demand what the founders had in mind when they set forth with the revolution. The revolution's ideas will outlast, I believe that the revolution's ideals outlast the founders' limitations. And I think that's not nothing. All right, I believe that as Americans, as a historian, I believe the American Foundation is a genuine achievement, but also has genuine holes in it. And both of those things can be true at the same time. All right, a nation that could produce the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, while holding 500,000 people in bondage, while dispossessing the continent's original inhabitants, and denying half of the population any formal political voice, that's not a finished project. But it was a start, and it's a very important start. As Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King noted, this is a promissory note. Each of them say it is in their own way, but they say that this is the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence is a promissory note that had not yet been fully redeemed. All right, that unfinished quality is not a reason for despair. It is, in a sense, the most important thing about the American experience. That is always contained within itself the seeds of its own critique and the principles that the founders proclaimed to have always been available to those, even if they were excluded. And that is a significant history that we need to remember in the United States. Thank you, guys.